Western world has successfully defended itself against some of the most terrifying forces of evil ever faced by humankind. But these forces were always external threats. Great civilizations have always been able to resist pressure from the outside. And yet, it is the insider threat which has allowed the enemy to penetrate the defensive structures and cause the collapse of many a great nation. Today, our society is populated with these cultural arsonists who naively hope that by burning down tradition, history, and institution, that a new utopia will rise from the ashes, rather than building upon and improving existing structure. This is like hoping that a tornado hits a junkyard and leaves you with a functioning Boeing 737. Nowhere else in the Western world is this juvenile fantasy more evident than in the formerly great country of Sweden. And as I hope to show in this presentation, Sweden offers us a blueprint of our own future if we allow these cultural arsonists to push their insane agenda unchallenged. So why do I compare them to arsonists? Let's look at a couple definitions, and we'll see if it becomes more clear. Let's start by looking at the phenomenon of pyromania. Pyromania is an impulse control disorder in which individuals repeatedly fail to resist impulses to deliberately start fires in order to relieve tension or for instant gratification. Pyromaniacs start fires to induce euphoria and stand in rapt fascination at the destruction they have wrought. Someone suffering from this disorder deliberately and purposely sets fires on more than one occasion, and before the act of lighting the fire, the person usually experiences tension and an emotional buildup. When around fires, a person suffering from pyromania gains intense interest or fascination and may also experience pleasure, gratification, or relief. When studying the lifestyle of someone with pyromania, a buildup of stress and emotion is often evident. Common causes of pyromania can be broken down into two main groups: individual and environmental. Environmental factors include neglect from parents and physical or emotional abuse in earlier life. Many studies have shown that patients with pyromania were in households without a father figure present. Pyromania was thought in the 1800s to be a concept involved with moral insanity. Pyromania is one of the 4 recognized types of arson, alongside burning for profit, to cover up an act of crime, and for revenge. Arson, however, is the crime of willfully and maliciously setting fire to or charring property. And while arson is seen as deliberate, well, in pyromania, it is supposedly pathological. The end result is the same. And with this concept in mind, let's look at some articles about the country of Sweden. This first one was authored by Paul Joseph Watson, whom, if you are not following, I cannot recommend him enough. Since the 1970s, when Sweden was the fourth richest country in the world per capita, and when virtually all of its inhabitants still saw Sweden as folkhemmet, or the people's home, where everyone would take care of everyone else. Conditions in Sweden have deteriorated drastically. A new survey shows that 51% of women in Stockholm, Sweden, feel unsafe going out at night, while the number who feel insecure in the daytime has doubled. Since 2011, the proportion of citizens who feel unsafe in their own residential area during the daytime almost doubled from 11% to 20%. The growing insecurity in Stockholm is also underscored by the fact that more and more county residents are refraining from activities due to concern about being exposed to crime, such as walking, cinema, or visiting acquaintances, the report stated. 34% of county residents now say they have ceased almost all outdoor activity due to fear of crime, compared to 20% who gave the corresponding answer in 2011. Sweden continues to experience huge problems with violent crime, shootings, explosions, and grenade attacks, mostly as a result of turf warfare between rival migrant gangs. The country has accepted hundreds of thousands of new migrants, mainly from Africa and the Middle East, since 2015. Meanwhile, new figures show that more Swedes than ever before are on antidepressants, with 1 million of them taking the pharmaceutical drugs. That's 1/10 of the population, double the amount who took antidepressants in the early 2000s. New figures from the European Union Statistical Bureau, Eurostat, show that unemployment is rising in Sweden. According to Eurostat, unemployment there was 7.4% in August, whereas the EU average for August was 6.2%. This leaves Sweden on Eurostat's unemployment ranking of countries at number 24 out of 28. In 2015, during the European migration crisis, nearly 163,000 migrants arrived in Sweden seeking asylum, primarily from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, according to a recent report by the daily newspaper Aftonbladet. Out of those 163,000 migrants, 60,000 received a resident permit. In the group of people over the age of 15, made up 40,000 people, only 4,574 get their livelihood from employment. Municipal Councillor Johanna Odo said, "The industries have a very limited need for people without experience and education. Even if we had money to hire more people, we would not find these people among those who are outside the labor market in our municipality today." Every fourth municipality and every third region, according to a report by the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, SKL, had a budget deficit in 2018. At least 110 municipalities expect to run a deficit this year. Many municipalities, therefore, need to make budget cuts. In Ystad, to save money, the municipality will no longer serve hot meals to the elderly and will reduce cleaning services. In the Motala municipality, according to a report in the Aftonbladet, they announced that it would lower the heat in buildings managed by the city, including old age homes, to save money. They claim, "We will take care of the elderly. They will not be freezing. They can have blankets," the message went. Residents at Diana Gardon were told they would have to leave because the toilets in the facility were 5 centimeters too small to comply with regulations. Dozens of elderly residents were forced to leave their apartments in an area of Stockholm after the block was closed, only to be reopened again for migrants to replace them. A survey conducted by SVT found that 8 in 10 municipalities will be forced to save in the coming year, and half plan to cut assistance for the disabled and family care as their economies suffer. In order to reduce their expenses, an LSS housing and a daily activity for the mentally disabled will also be closed down. 2.5 million less will be given to preschools, reduction of student health care, review the number of playgrounds, reduce street lighting by 20%, and let it snow more before paving the roads. And also, supposedly, reduce politicians' wages by 5%. 2 years ago, when Sylvi Listhaug, Norway's then Minister of Immigration and Integration, used a term after visiting some of Sweden's worst Muslim enclaves: Swedish conditions. Swedish conditions means basically one thing: admitting masses of unvetted immigrants from a very different culture into your country, encouraging them to settle in monocultural, autocratic enclaves that become no-go zones, allowing them to sit home collecting generous welfare benefits instead of learning the local language and finding jobs, and punishing even their most brutal crimes with a slap on the wrist, all the while continuing to repeat the mantra that their culture has enriched Sweden, and to ignore the glaring reality that Sweden is undergoing a long-term conquest, as well as what one Norwegian observer has called an inferno of violence. Now, much of this was championed and enabled by the mainstream press, and just recently, a left-wing journalist in Sweden who vehemently supported mass immigration has changed her tune, admitting that when it came to Sweden's crime-ridden, no-go zone areas, quote, everyone knew it would end in disaster. Amazingly, Aftonbladet's Lena Milan. Ugh. Oh, what's that, Wayne June? You have something to say?
It is a travesty, a blundering mountain of hatred and rage.
Lena Milan now acknowledges that Sweden's attempt to integrate huge numbers of migrants from Africa and the Middle East has failed. Numerous people pointed out the hypocrisy of Milan, admitting she knew integration was failing, yet still refusing to abandon her support for mass immigration. Ted Ekeroth tweeted, "Incredible! Lena Milan, of all journalists, one of the foremost advocates for mass immigration and multiculturalism, one of the worst SD haters, claims that one has known for years that it would all go to hell." But it's not just the journalists. World leaders know this too. Consider German Chancellor Angela Merkel's statement in 2010 that multiculturalism has, quote, utterly failed. And by 2015, she would admit, quote, multiculturalism leads to parallel societies and therefore remains a life lie or a sham. She said, before adding that Germany may be reaching its limits in terms of accepting more refugees. The challenge is immense, she said. We want and we will reduce the number of refugees noticeably. It is a historical test for Europe, she said, adding that other countries in Europe should accept more refugees to take some of the burden off Germany. German authorities are expected to ramp up deportation activities in the coming months. In another article here by Paul Joseph Watson, he points out, the former director of Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service has accused Angela Merkel of creating a, quote, security crisis in Germany as a result of her open border refugee policy. We have seen the consequences of this decision in terms of German public opinion and internal security. We experience problems every day, he said. We have criminals, terrorist suspects, and people who use multiple identities. Those who carried out the Berlin attacks used 12 different identities, added Hanning. While things are tighter today, we still have 300,000 people in Germany of whose identities we cannot be sure. That's a massive security risk, he warned. After Merkel abolished normal border controls back in 2015, Germany took in over 1.5 million migrants from affected countries in a single year. According to the German government's own statistics, violent crime in Germany rose by 10% between 2015 and 2016, when the country began accepting large numbers of migrants, many of them young men. More than 90% of the rise was attributable to young male refugees. And so what's astonishing in all of this, both the journalists in the mainstream and the leaders of these European countries knew and openly stated that their policies did not work and would fail. And yet they advocated for them anyway. I can see this as nothing else than a willful destruction of one's own society and culture. Cultural arsonism, if you will. And so how should this cultural betrayal be addressed? While arson is typically classified as a felony, there are instances involving a greater degree of risk to human life or property that carry stricter penalties. Many legal systems divide arson into degrees. Third-degree arson, burning an abandoned building or an abandoned area, such as a field, forest, or woods. Second-degree arson, burning an unoccupied building, such as an empty barn or an unoccupied house or other structure, in order to claim insurance on such property. Or first-degree arson, burning an occupied structure, such as a school or place where people are normally present. Raymond Lee Euler set a 2006 fire in Southern California that led to the deaths of 5 U.S. Forest Service firefighters. He was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to death. No matter how bleak the situation may look, I would like to think that there is still hope for Sweden. Perhaps they will end up rekindling their ancient Viking spirit. I'd like to end this by quoting the senior lecturer in Icelandic literature, Mathias Vidar Samundsson, a scholar on the Viking Eddic poet, Have 'em all. The ethics of Have 'em all are above all rooted in belief in the value of the individual, who is nonetheless not alone in the world, but tied by inextricable bonds to nature and society. To adherents of such a philosophy, the cycle of life was single and indivisible. The living world, in all its manifestations, formed a harmonious whole. Infringements upon nature struck at the root of man's own existence. In the old philosophy of the North, each individual was responsible for his own life, shaped his own fortune or misfortune, and created a life for himself from his own resources. Perhaps the heathen philosophy of life has never had a more immediate message than today, in this age that practices contempt for humanity and nature instead of admiration.